When the 41st millennium was still young, and the Emperor's light burned brighter across the galaxy, long before the Great Rift tore reality asunder, something stirred in the intergalactic void beyond the galaxy's edge. Their origins remain shrouded in mystery, even to the most learned Magos Biologus of the Adeptus Mechanicus. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of a consciousness so vast and hungry that it had already consumed countless galaxies when humanity first looked up at the stars. In the grim darkness of the far future, few threats inspire such primal terror as the Tyranids, the Great Devourer that comes from beyond the galactic rim. Unlike the familiar horrors of chaos, which corrupt and twist the existing order, or the ancient grudges of Xenos races locked in eternal conflict, the Tyranids represent something far more absolute: the complete negation of all organic life in the galaxy. They are not conquerors seeking dominion, nor zealots pursuing ideology. They are hunger incarnate, a biological imperative so pure and relentless that it reduces the vast complexity of galactic civilization to a single terrifying equation: consume or be consumed. The Milky Way galaxy, with its 400 billion stars and countless worlds teeming with life, contains an estimated biomass that defies comprehension. Every human world, every orc stronghold, every Eldar craft world, every spawn of chaos all represent nothing more than potential sustenance to the approaching swarm. Archaeological evidence suggests that the total organic matter contained within our galaxy could sustain a Tyranid hive fleet for perhaps 1,000 years of continuous growth and reproduction. Yet fragmentary records recovered from the Outer Rim tell a different story: that what approaches may already have consumed a dozen galaxies, each larger than our own. The first warnings came not from Imperial scouts or explorator fleets, but from the ancient Eldar, whose prophetic visions spoke of a shadow in the warp that would one day eclipse even the light of the Astronomicon. These warnings, delivered through cryptic utterances and dire prophecies, were largely dismissed by Imperial authorities as typical Xenos manipulation. The Eldar spoke of a hunger that devours light itself, of a consciousness so vast that it could think with the minds of trillions of creatures simultaneously, and of an evolutionary perfection that would render all existing life obsolete. But even the Eldar's dire predictions failed to capture the true horror of what was coming. Hidden within the deepest archives of the Mechanicus, sealed records speak of ancient warnings that predate even the Great Crusade. Explorator fleets dispatched to the galactic rim in the early centuries of the Imperium had discovered something that challenged every assumption about the nature of life in the universe. These expeditions, launched during humanity's most optimistic expansion, had ventured beyond the edge of the galaxy itself, seeking new worlds to claim in the Emperor's name. What they found in the intergalactic void was not empty space, but evidence of consumption on a scale that dwarfed even the greatest Imperial achievements. The few surviving records describe entire star systems stripped, not just of life, but of every organic molecule. Worlds reduced to bare rock, their atmospheres scrubbed clean of even the most basic chemical compounds that might support biological processes. These discoveries were so disturbing that they were classified at the highest levels of the Mechanicus hierarchy, deemed too dangerous for widespread knowledge. The implications were clear: something was methodically consuming not just civilizations, but the very possibility of life itself. As the 40th millennium drew to a close, astronomers working in the Eastern Fringe began to notice subtle changes in the night sky. Stars that had burned for billions of years began to dim and disappear, not through natural stellar evolution, but in patterns that suggested systematic harvesting. Gravitational anomalies appeared in previously empty regions of space, massive enough to suggest the presence of matter concentrations rivaling entire star systems. Most disturbing of all, the warp itself began to exhibit strange distortions along the galaxy's eastern edge, as if something was actively suppressing the psychic energy that allowed faster-than-light travel and communication. The truth that Imperial authorities were not yet ready to face was that the galaxy's entire biomass might prove insufficient to satisfy what was approaching. Ancient Eldar texts, when properly translated, spoke not of a single threat, but of a hierarchy of consumption that spanned multiple galaxies. The fragments described hive fleets so vast that they could blot out entire star clusters, and a reproductive capacity that could transform a single consumed world into 1 million bioships within a standard Terran year. Most terrifying of all, these texts suggested that what was approaching the Milky Way represented not the full strength of the Tyranid species, but merely the outermost tendrils of a far greater organism. The shadow that was about to fall across the galaxy would prove to be darker and more absolute than any threat humanity had yet faced. For it carried with it the promise of a future where not just human civilization, but all possibility of life itself would be nothing more than a distant memory echoing through empty space. The galaxy of the late 40th millennium was a realm of endless conflict, yet it possessed a terrible familiarity. The Imperium of man had endured 10,000 years of war against enemies that, while horrific, operated within understood parameters. Chaos sought to corrupt and dominate. The orcs lived for the joy of battle, the Eldar pursued their own mysterious agendas, and the Necrons slumbered in their tomb worlds. Each threat, no matter how devastating, could be comprehended through the lens of human experience. They possessed motivations, however alien, that Imperial strategists could analyze and counter. The Eastern Fringe in M40 represented the bleeding edge of Imperial expansion, where brave explorator fleets and hardy colonists pushed ever outward in search of new worlds to claim for the Emperor. This region, spanning roughly 50,000 light-years beyond the established borders of Segmentum Ultima, contained an estimated 200 billion star systems, most completely unexplored. The Imperial presence was sparse, perhaps 1 in 10,000 systems maintained even a monitoring station, and fully established colonies numbered in the mere thousands. It was a frontier region where individual ship captains and planetary governors operated with unprecedented autonomy, their reports taking months or years to reach the distant bureaucracies of Terra. The environmental conditions of the Eastern Fringe were uniquely suited to Imperial expansion. Unlike the daemon-haunted regions near the Eye of Terror or the Necron-infested worlds of the galactic core, this area appeared relatively free of major threats. Warp storms were infrequent, allowing for reliable faster-than-light travel. The stellar density was optimal for supporting human life, with numerous G-class stars hosting potentially habitable worlds. Archaeological surveys suggested that this region had been largely untouched by the galaxy's previous civilizations, offering pristine worlds ready for terraforming and colonization. Yet even as Imperial colonists celebrated their good fortune in discovering this apparent paradise, subtle signs of something amiss began to accumulate in the deepest archives of the Mechanicus. Explorator fleets pushing beyond the galaxy's edge reported finding systems that showed signs of having once supported massive populations, but now stood completely barren. These were not the familiar ruins of ancient civilizations, but worlds that had been systematically stripped of all organic matter. The very soil had been processed, leaving behind only sterile rock and metal deposits. The pattern was so consistent that it defied natural explanation. World after world showed evidence of having supported thriving ecosystems within the past 10,000 years, yet now contained not a single organic molecule. The atmospheric compositions were wrong. Too much carbon dioxide, too little oxygen, as if vast quantities of plant matter had been suddenly removed from the carbon cycle. Ocean beds lay exposed and desiccated, their waters somehow extracted along with every fish, plant, and microscopic organism they had once contained. Magos Explorator Deltrian Vex, leading the 47th Explorator Fleet, documented over 300 such worlds in the sector designated Ultima Extremis. His reports, filed in 987.M40, described a phenomenon that challenged every understanding of planetary ecology. These worlds had not died gradually through environmental collapse or stellar evolution. They had been harvested with surgical precision, their entire biospheres removed while leaving geological structures intact. Vex's calculations suggested that the biomass extraction had occurred simultaneously across multiple star systems, implying a coordination and scale that seemed impossible. The few survivors found in this region told stories that were dismissed as frontier madness. Void traders spoke of living asteroids that moved against gravitational currents. Isolated colonists reported nightmares of infinite hunger that drove men to madness. Most disturbing were the accounts of angel sickness, a condition that seemed to affect entire populations, causing them to become obsessively focused on reproduction and genetic purity. Medical authorities attributed these reports to isolation psychosis and the stresses of frontier life, but the pattern was too widespread to ignore entirely. Statistical analysis of missing explorator fleets revealed another troubling trend. Of the 847 deep space expeditions launched toward the galactic rim between 950.M40 and 9999.M40, only 23 had returned with complete crews. Another 156 had returned with significantly reduced numbers, their crews reporting encounters with void predators that defied classification. The remaining 668 expeditions had vanished entirely, their astropathic communications ceasing abruptly at the edge of charted space. Even more ominous were the reports from the Astronomic Enquirer on Terra. Beginning in 985.M40, the psychic beacon that guided Imperial navigation began to exhibit strange resonances when directed toward the Eastern Fringe. The choir described these distortions as something vast and hungry that seemed to absorb psychic energy rather than reflecting it. Master navigators reported increasing difficulty in plotting courses to the region, as if the very fabric of space-time was being distorted by some massive presence. The few intact recordings recovered from lost expeditions painted a picture of something approaching from beyond the galaxy's edge. Vox recordings, often corrupted and fragmentary, spoke of living ships that moved in perfect coordination despite being separated by light years. Picked captures showed shadows against the cosmic background radiation, shadows that seemed to be moving with purpose and intelligence. Most disturbing were the biological samples, fragments of organic matter unlike anything in the Imperial taxonomic database, displaying cellular structures that seemed to violate basic principles of biochemistry. The transition from isolated incidents to coordinated invasion began so gradually that Imperial authorities failed to recognize the pattern until it was far too late. What would later be identified as the vanguard organisms of Hive Fleet Behemoth had been infiltrating the Eastern Fringe for decades, seeding worlds with genetic material that would serve as beacons for the approaching swarm. The first confirmed sighting of what would become known as Tyranids occurred in 745.M41, when the exploration vessel Emperor's Bounty encountered a cluster of organisms in the Helix Nebula that defied all attempts at classification. Captain Mortian Voss, commanding the Emperor's Bounty, filed a report describing creatures that appeared to be living starships, each one unique yet clearly part of a unified organism. The bioships moved with perfect coordination, responding to threats and opportunities with a speed that suggested instantaneous communication across vast distances. When the Emperor's Bounty attempted to establish contact, the creatures responded not with aggression, but with what Voss described as predatory curiosity, miters circling the Imperial vessel and apparently studying its design and capabilities. The encounter lasted for 18 hours, during which the bioships demonstrated abilities that challenged every assumption about spacefaring life. They could alter their internal structure in real time, growing new appendages or organs as needed. Their hulls showed clear evidence of technological integration, with what appeared to be organic equivalents of void shields, plasma drives, and weapon systems. Most unnervingly, they seemed to learn from their interaction with the Imperial vessel, gradually developing countermeasures for every scanning attempt and weapon system activation. When the Emperor's Bounty finally disengaged and fled toward the nearest Imperial outpost, the bioships made no attempt to pursue. Instead, they simply watched, as if cataloging the Imperial vessel's capabilities for future reference. Voss's report, filed with the Sector Command on Baca, was initially classified as a probable encounter with unknown Xenos technology. The biological nature of the vessels was considered too improbable for serious consideration, despite the detailed sensor readings and pic captures that accompanied the report. The systematic nature of the Tyranid advance became apparent only in retrospect, as Imperial analysts pieced together scattered reports from across the Eastern Fringe. The pattern was always the same. First, isolated outposts would report unusual biological phenomena, accelerated evolution in local fauna, strange new species appearing overnight, existing creatures displaying unprecedented aggression and intelligence. These initial changes were subtle enough to be dismissed as natural variation, or the result of local environmental factors. The second phase involved the appearance of what Imperial forces would later identify as Genestealer infiltration. Mining colonies and agricultural worlds began reporting increased birth rates and unusual genetic variations in their populations. Medical authorities noted clusters of mutations that seemed to follow hereditary patterns, but the changes were beneficial rather than harmful. Increased strength, enhanced reflexes, improved resistance to disease. Colonial governments celebrated these developments as evidence of successful adaptation to their new environments. The third phase was the arrival of the vanguard organisms themselves. Scout-class bioships, each roughly the size of an Imperial frigate, began appearing in the outer systems of targeted sectors. These vessels moved with purpose and intelligence, conducting detailed surveys of planetary defenses and resource concentrations. They avoided direct confrontation with Imperial forces, instead focusing on gathering intelligence and seeding additional worlds with infiltration organisms. Imperial Navy patrols that encountered these scout vessels reported engagements that challenged every principle of void warfare. The bioships demonstrated the ability to rapidly adapt their tactics and even their physical structure in response to Imperial weapons. Las cannon batteries that proved effective in initial engagements would find their targets suddenly resistant to energy weapons. Torpedo salvos would be countered by the spontaneous development of point defense organisms that emerged from the bioships' hulls. The coordination between seemingly separate bioships suggested a level of strategic thinking that Imperial commanders found deeply unsettling. Vessels separated by light years would respond to threats with perfect synchronization, as if they shared a single mind. This coordination extended to the infiltration organisms as well. Genestealer cults on worlds thousands of light years apart would activate simultaneously, suggesting a level of communication that transcended normal space-time limitations. The first major planetary consumption occurred on the world of Tyran in 741.M41, an event that would give the species its name. The agricultural world, home to 12 million Imperial citizens, fell silent over the course of a single month. When the Imperial Navy finally dispatched a relief fleet to investigate, they found a world completely stripped of organic matter. The cities remained intact, but empty of all life, not just human, but every plant, animal, and microorganism had been systematically removed. The consumption of Tyran revealed the true purpose of the biological infiltration. The Genestealer cults that had been developing within the population for decades had not been preparing for rebellion, but for harvest. They had mapped every source of biomass on the planet, cataloged every living creature, and prepared the population for systematic consumption. The process had been so efficient that it left no survivors to report on the methods used. Forensic analysis of Tyran revealed the terrifying efficiency of Tyranid consumption. The planet's biomass had been processed at the molecular level, with organic compounds broken down into their component elements and absorbed into the bioship's living hulls. The speed of consumption suggested a level of biological technology that far exceeded anything in the Imperial arsenal. Most disturbing was the evidence that the consumption process had been selective. Certain genetic sequences had been preserved and incorporated into the bioships themselves, suggesting that the Tyranids were not merely consuming biomass, but actively harvesting genetic information. The fall of Tyran marked the beginning of what Imperial historians would later recognize as the First Tyrannic War. The scattered incidents and isolated encounters of the previous decades suddenly coalesced into a coordinated invasion of unprecedented scale and sophistication. The Eastern Fringe, which had seemed like humanity's most promising frontier, was about to become the stage for a war that would determine the fate of all life in the galaxy. The Imperial response to the fall of Tyran was swift but tragically inadequate. Battlefleet Tempestus, under the command of Admiral Wrath, was dispatched to the Outer Rim with orders to investigate the disappearance of the agricultural world and establish the nature of the threat. The fleet consisted of 17 vessels, including the battle barge Fist of Dorn and 2 companies of Imperial Fist Space Marines. It was a force considered more than sufficient to deal with any conventional threat, yet it would prove woefully unprepared for what awaited them in the void. The first engagement occurred at the edge of the Tyran system, where Admiral Wrath's fleet encountered a formation of bioships that defied every tactical manual in the Imperial arsenal. The creatures, for they were clearly alive rather than constructed, moved with fluid grace through the void, their hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to serve as some form of communication. The largest of these organisms measured nearly 8 kilometers in length, rivaling an Imperial battleship in size, yet it moved with the agility of a fighter craft. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists, observing from the battle barge's command deck, later described the encounter as warfare against the impossible. The bioships demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about space combat. They could alter their configuration in real time, growing new weapon appendages or defensive structures as tactical situations demanded. Their hull integrity seemed to be maintained not by metal and ceramite, but by some form of regenerative tissue that could repair battle damage even as it was being inflicted. The Imperial fleet's opening salvo, a coordinated barrage of macro cannon shells and lance strikes, achieved initial success against the bioships. Several of the smaller organisms were destroyed outright, their biological hulls unable to withstand the concentrated firepower. However, the survivors demonstrated an ability that would haunt Imperial tacticians for centuries to come. They adapted. The bioships that had been damaged but not destroyed began to exhibit new defensive capabilities, their hulls developing what appeared to be organic equivalents of void shields. More disturbing still was the bioships' apparent ability to learn from their fallen comrades. Analysis of the battle's progression revealed that the surviving organisms had incorporated defensive adaptations based on the specific weapon signatures that had destroyed their fellows. Las cannon batteries that had proven effective in the opening minutes of the engagement found their targets suddenly resistant to energy weapons. Torpedo salvos were countered by point defense organisms that emerged from the bioships' hulls like antibodies responding to infection. The turning point of the engagement came when the bioships began to demonstrate their offensive capabilities. Instead of conventional weapons, they deployed what Imperial forces would later classify as living ammunition. Swarms of smaller organisms that moved with purpose and intelligence. These creatures, later identified as Tyranid boarding spores, were capable of breaching Imperial ship hulls and disgorging their contents directly into the vessel's interior spaces. The defense of the Imperial cruiser Righteous Fury provided the first detailed combat reports of Tyranid ground forces. The boarding spores delivered creatures that challenged every principle of xenobiology. The largest of these organisms, standing nearly 4 meters tall and designated as carnifex by Imperial taxonomists, demonstrated physical capabilities that exceeded even orc knobs. Their chitinous carapaces could deflect bolter rounds, while their massive claws could tear through bulkhead armor as if it were parchment. Even more disturbing were the smaller organisms that accompanied the larger bioforms. These creatures, later classified as Genestealers, moved with frightening speed and intelligence through the ship's corridors. They demonstrated tactical awareness that suggested individual intelligence, yet they coordinated their attacks with perfect precision. Imperial defenders reported that the creatures seemed to anticipate their movements, flanking defensive positions and exploiting weaknesses in their formations with uncanny accuracy. The biological weapons deployed by the Tyranid organisms proved particularly effective against Imperial forces. Many of the creatures carried ranged weapons that were clearly organic in nature. Living artillery that could fire projectiles with devastating accuracy. These weapons appeared to be symbiotic organisms feeding on their host's energy while providing destructive capability. The projectiles themselves were living creatures, capable of burrowing into targets and continuing to cause damage long after initial impact. Naval engagement records from the Tyran system revealed the horrifying efficiency of Tyranid consumption tactics. Bioships that had been damaged in combat would approach destroyed Imperial vessels not to salvage technology, but to consume the organic matter within. The process was startlingly rapid. An entire crew complement could be processed and absorbed within hours. More disturbing was the evidence that this consumption was selective, with certain genetic sequences being preserved and incorporated into the bioship's own biological matrix. The psychic implications of the Tyranid presence became apparent during the prolonged engagement. Imperial navigators reported increasing difficulty in using their abilities, describing a shadow that seemed to obscure their perception of the warp. This phenomenon, later identified as the shadow in the warp, appeared to be generated by the bioships themselves. The creatures seemed to exist in a state of psychic nullification, creating dead zones in the immaterium that prevented both faster-than-light travel and astropathic communication. The tactical implications of this psychic shadow were immediately apparent. Imperial forces found themselves unable to coordinate with reinforcements or retreat through warp travel. The bioships, unaffected by this limitation, could maneuver freely while their opponents were trapped in normal space. This asymmetric advantage allowed the Tyranids to dictate the terms of engagement, surrounding and isolating Imperial forces before methodically destroying them. The survival of only 3 Imperial vessels from Admiral Wrath's fleet provided crucial intelligence about Tyranid capabilities, but at a devastating cost. The battle barge Fist of Dorn, carrying 2 full companies of Imperial fists, was lost with all hands. The survivors reported that the bioships had shown particular interest in the Space Marines, seeming to prioritize their capture over simple destruction. This selective targeting suggested that the Tyranids were not merely consuming biomass, but actively harvesting genetic information from their most capable opponents. The few escape pods that managed to flee the system carried reports that would fundamentally alter Imperial understanding of the threat they faced. The Tyranids were not simply another xeno-species to be catalogued and countered, but a form of life that operated on principles completely alien to Imperial science. They represented a fundamental challenge to the very concept of individual existence, functioning as a collective organism that could think with millions of minds simultaneously while maintaining perfect coordination across vast distances. The Imperial military doctrine of the late 40th millennium represented the culmination of 10,000 years of warfare against every conceivable threat. The Imperium's approach to conflict had been refined through countless campaigns against Chaos Space Marines, Orc-Waz, Eldar raids, and countless other Xenos incursions. This vast experience had created a military machine of unprecedented sophistication, built upon principles of overwhelming firepower, tactical flexibility, and unwavering devotion to the Emperor's will. The Space Marines, humanity's finest warriors, embodied the pinnacle of Imperial military capability. Each Astartes was a genetically enhanced superhuman, equipped with power armor that provided protection against the most devastating weapons while enhancing their already superhuman abilities. Their tactical doctrine emphasized rapid deployment, surgical strikes, and the application of overwhelming force at critical points. The average Space Marine could engage dozens of conventional enemies simultaneously, while their veteran sergeants and captains possessed centuries of combat experience against every known form of alien threat. The Imperial Guard, numbering in the countless billions across the galaxy, represented the Imperium's capacity for sustained warfare on a galactic scale. Their doctrine emphasized massed firepower, coordinated artillery strikes, and the ability to absorb casualties while maintaining offensive momentum. Imperial Guard regiments were equipped with standardized weapons and equipment that had proven effective against every known enemy. Las guns, though individually less powerful than the bolters carried by Space Marines, could be produced in unlimited quantities and required minimal maintenance in the field. The Imperial Navy dominated the void, with vessels that represented the apex of human engineering. Battleships like the Emperor-class carried weapon batteries capable of devastating entire continents, while their void shields could withstand the concentrated fire of entire enemy fleets. The Navy's tactical doctrine emphasized the projection of power across interstellar distances, with the ability to deploy overwhelming force anywhere in the galaxy within months of receiving orders. Their experience in void warfare spanned conflicts against every known spacefaring species, from the ramshackle but numerous Orc fleets to the sophisticated vessels of the Tau Empire. The technological superiority of Imperial forces was built upon 10 millennia of accumulated knowledge and innovation. Lost weapons provided reliable, maintenance-free firepower that could be recharged from any energy source. Power armor enhanced human capabilities while providing protection against the most devastating attacks. Plasma weapons could melt through the heaviest armor, while melta-weapons could breach even the most sophisticated defenses. The Imperial arsenal included weapons designed specifically to counter every known form of alien technology, from the orcish love of crude but effective weaponry to the elegant energy weapons of the Eldar. The command structure of Imperial forces represented centuries of organizational refinement. The chain of command was clear and absolute, with each level of hierarchy trained to operate independently when communications were disrupted. Imperial commanders possessed extensive education in xenobiology, allowing them to anticipate and counter alien tactics. The Codex Astartes, written by Primarch Robout Guilliman himself, provided tactical guidance that had proven effective against every conceivable threat over the course of 10,000 years. The logistical capabilities of the Imperium were perhaps its greatest strength. The ability to transport, supply, and coordinate military forces across galactic distances was unmatched by any other faction. Imperial Guard regiments could be deployed from one end of the galaxy to the other within standard years, complete with all necessary equipment and supplies. The Munitorium's vast warehouses contained stockpiles of weapons and ammunition sufficient to supply entire crusades for decades. This logistical supremacy meant that Imperial forces could sustain prolonged campaigns where other factions would be forced to retreat or seek alternative supply sources. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of the Imperium provided commanders with detailed knowledge of their enemy's strengths and weaknesses. The Ordo Xenos maintained extensive files on every known alien species, including detailed tactical assessments and recommended countermeasures. Imperial scholars had studied captured alien technology for millennia, developing specific weapons and tactics to exploit known vulnerabilities. This institutional knowledge meant that Imperial forces rarely faced truly unknown threats, as even the most exotic aliens usually employed familiar principles of warfare. The psychological warfare capabilities of Imperial forces were refined through centuries of experience against enemies who relied on fear and intimidation. The sight of Space Marines in battle array could break the morale of entire enemy armies, while the thunderous bombardments of Imperial artillery had been known to cause mass surrenders before ground forces even engaged. The Imperial Guard's discipline and unwavering faith in the Emperor provided them with resistance to the psychological attacks that had proven effective against other human armies. The adaptive capabilities of Imperial doctrine allowed forces to modify their tactics based on battlefield experience. The Codex Astartes provided general principles that could be applied to any situation, while local commanders possessed the authority to develop specific countermeasures for regional threats. This flexibility had proven crucial in campaigns against enemies who employed novel tactics or technologies, allowing Imperial forces to evolve their strategies in real time. Yet beneath this impressive facade of military supremacy lay subtle vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when faced with an enemy that operated outside all established parameters. The Imperial military machine was optimized for warfare against enemies that thought, planned, and fought like humans. Even the most alien opponents possessed individual motivations, hierarchical command structures, and resource limitations that Imperial strategists could understand and exploit. The greatest weakness of Imperial doctrine was its reliance on communication and coordination. The vast distances of galactic warfare required constant astropathic communication to maintain operational effectiveness. Imperial forces were trained to operate independently for short periods, but extended isolation from higher command inevitably led to reduced effectiveness. The assumption that communication would remain available even if disrupted was built into every level of Imperial military planning. The technological base of Imperial weapons, while reliable and effective, was designed to counter known forms of alien technology. Loss weapons were optimized for use against metallic armor and energy shields. Bolter rounds were designed to penetrate and explode within conventional organic targets. Power weapons were engineered to disrupt the molecular bonds of materials commonly used in alien construction. The entire Imperial arsenal was built upon assumptions about the nature of their enemies that had proven valid for 10,000 years. The command structure that gave Imperial forces their effectiveness also created dependencies that could be exploited. The clear hierarchies and standardized procedures that enabled coordination across vast distances also made Imperial forces predictable to enemies who understood their doctrine. The reliance on established command protocols meant that Imperial forces were vulnerable to tactics that fell outside their training and experience. Most critically, the Imperial military doctrine was predicated on the assumption that all enemies, however alien, would conform to basic principles of individual existence and resource limitation. Every known species, from the most primitive orcs to the most advanced Tau, operated within constraints that Imperial strategists could understand and counter. The concept of an enemy that existed as a collective consciousness, with unlimited reproductive capacity and the ability to adapt in real time to any countermeasure, was simply beyond the scope of Imperial military theory. The phenomenon that would later be identified as the Shadow in the Warp began as subtle disturbances in astropathic communication across the Eastern Fringe. Imperial navigators, those gifted individuals who guided humanity's ships through the treacherous currents of the immaterium, reported increasing difficulty in perceiving the Astronomican's guiding light. What had once been a brilliant beacon cutting through the psychic storms of the warp began to appear dimmed and distorted, as if something vast and hungry was absorbing the Emperor's divine radiance. The initial manifestations were dismissed as local phenomena. The warp had always been unpredictable, subject to storms and eddies that could disrupt faster-than-light travel and communication. However, the pattern of disturbances followed a consistent progression, moving inward from the galaxy's edge with methodical precision. Star systems that had maintained regular astropathic contact for centuries suddenly fell silent, their communications cut off as if a curtain of absolute darkness had fallen across them. Magos biologists call, conducting research on the frontier worlds of the Eastern Fringe, documented the first systematic observations of what he termed psychic nullification zones. These areas, initially spanning only a few light years, exhibited complete absence of warp activity. Psykers entering these regions reported immediate loss of their abilities, while daemons and other warp entities simply ceased to exist within the affected space. The implications were staggering. Something was actively suppressing the very force that made interstellar civilization possible. The expansion of these null zones followed a pattern that suggested deliberate intelligence rather than natural phenomenon. The areas of psychic suppression grew in size and intensity, but they expanded along specific vectors that corresponded to major shipping routes and communication networks. This selective targeting indicated that whatever was creating the shadow in the warp possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial infrastructure and was deliberately isolating key systems from outside support. The first major Imperial world to be completely cut off from astropathic communication was Prandium, an agricultural world that supplied food for 3 neighboring systems. The planet's governor, Militant Vex Corbin, initially attributed the communication blackout to solar flare activity or equipment failure. However, when physical courier ships were dispatched to investigate, they found the entire system shrouded in a psychic void that prevented any form of warp travel. The ships were forced to approach using conventional propulsion, a journey that took months rather than days. The isolation of individual star systems created a cascade effect throughout the region. Trade routes that had operated for millennia were suddenly severed, as merchant vessels found themselves unable to navigate through the expanding null zones. Imperial Guard regiments stationed in the affected areas could no longer coordinate with higher command, while Space Marine forces found their ability to respond to threats severely compromised. The careful balance of Imperial administration began to break down as centuries of interconnected dependencies were suddenly severed. The biological infiltration that had been proceeding quietly for decades began to accelerate as the psychic shadow deepened. Genestealer cults, their presence hidden for generations, began to emerge from the shadows on world after world. The timing was not coincidental. The psychic suppression that prevented Imperial communication also shielded the hybrids from detection by Imperial psychers and sanctioned telepaths. Without the ability to sense the alien taint, Imperial authorities were blind to the scope of the infiltration. The emergence of Genestealer cults followed a pattern that revealed the sophistication of the Tyranid infiltration strategy. On mining worlds, the hybrids had concentrated in the extraction industries, gaining control of the equipment and infrastructure necessary for resource processing. On agricultural worlds, they had infiltrated the food production and distribution networks, positioning themselves to control the biomass that would feed the approaching hive fleets. On forge worlds, they had worked their way into the technical castes, gaining access to the manufacturing capabilities that sustained Imperial civilization. The psychological warfare aspect of the Tyranid advance proved as devastating as their physical capabilities. The isolation created by the shadow and the warp induced a form of collective paranoia among Imperial populations. Without regular contact with the wider Imperium, local authorities began to suspect that they were the only remaining bastions of human civilization. This isolation was deliberately exploited by Genestealer cults, who positioned themselves as the only sources of reliable information and aid in the growing crisis. The adaptive nature of Tyranid infiltration became apparent as Imperial authorities attempted to respond to the threat. Traditional methods of cult suppression, developed over millennia of experience with chaos cults, proved largely ineffective against opponents who were genetically programmed for their mission. The hybrids displayed none of the telltale signs of chaos corruption that Imperial investigators had been trained to identify. Instead, they appeared to be model citizens, often distinguishing themselves through exceptional loyalty and dedication to their duties. The scope of the infiltration was revealed through careful analysis of birth records and genetic samples across the affected regions. Entire family lines showed subtle genetic modifications that had been accumulating over generations. The changes were so gradual that they had gone unnoticed by standard medical examinations, yet they represented a fundamental alteration of human genetic structure. The hybrids retained their human appearance and intelligence while possessing enhanced physical capabilities and an instinctive loyalty to the approaching hive fleets. The infrastructure sabotage that preceded the arrival of the main Tyranid forces demonstrated the strategic sophistication of the infiltration. Power plants experienced mysterious failures that crippled planetary defenses. Communications arrays suffered coordinated attacks that prevented calls for help. Military stockpiles were contaminated or destroyed through apparently accidental explosions. The cumulative effect was to leave Imperial worlds defenseless and isolated when the bioships finally arrived. The economic warfare conducted by the Genestealer cults was particularly insidious. By controlling key positions in planetary economies, the hybrids could manipulate resource allocation to serve Tyranid interests. Food production was redirected to create the maximum possible biomass for consumption. Industrial capacity was subtly altered to produce materials that would prove useful to the advancing hive fleets. Even Imperial Guard recruitment was influenced, with the cults ensuring that the most genetically valuable individuals were either protected from military service or positioned where they could be easily captured. The communication networks that had been infiltrated by the cults served as an early warning system for the approaching Tyranid forces. Information about Imperial military deployments, defensive capabilities, and resource concentrations was transmitted through channels that Imperial authorities could not detect or intercept. This intelligence allowed the bioships to approach their targets with perfect knowledge of what they would encounter, ensuring that resistance would be minimal and consumption would be efficient. The expanding influence of the Tyranid advance created a feedback loop that accelerated the process of galactic infiltration. Each world that fell to the hive fleets provided biomass that was immediately processed into new bioships and organisms. The genetic information harvested from consumed populations was incorporated into the Tyranid biological matrix, enhancing their capabilities and expanding their strategic options. This meant that the threat was not merely advancing, but growing stronger with each victory. The subtle signs of Genestealer infiltration that had been accumulating across the Eastern Fringe began to manifest as increasingly obvious anomalies that even the most bureaucratic Imperial authorities could not ignore. The first systematic reports of genetic deviation came from the medical facilities on Hiveworld Quintarn, where routine health screenings revealed birth defects that followed no known pattern of hereditary disease. The mutations were not random but appeared to follow specific genetic markers that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than natural variation. Dr. Ilara Voss, Chief Medical Officer of Quintarn's primary hive spire, documented over 3,000 cases of what she termed beneficial aberration in the population. The affected individuals displayed enhanced physical strength, improved reflexes, and increased resistance to disease. More disturbing was their apparent intelligence enhancement. Cognitive testing revealed that the mutants consistently scored higher on problem-solving exercises and displayed remarkable aptitude for technical tasks. These positive traits made the genetic deviations appear beneficial rather than threatening, leading many planetary authorities to celebrate rather than investigate the phenomenon. The frequency of these genetic anomalies increased exponentially over the course of several decades. What had begun as isolated cases affecting perhaps 1 in 10,000 births gradually expanded to encompass entire family lines. Medical records showed that the traits were hereditary, passing from parents to children with mathematical precision. The genetic modifications were so sophisticated that they appeared to be the result of advanced biotechnology rather than natural mutation. Yet no source for such technology could be identified. The behavioral patterns exhibited by the affected populations provided the first clues to the true nature of the threat. The enhanced individuals displayed an unusual degree of social cohesion, forming tight-knit communities that supported each other through increasingly sophisticated networks. These groups demonstrated remarkable efficiency in organizing labor, managing resources, and coordinating activities across vast distances. However, their cooperation extended only to others who shared their genetic modifications, creating a subtle but growing divide within Imperial society. The industrial implications of the genetic modifications became apparent as the affected populations began to concentrate in specific sectors of the economy. Mining operations staffed by the enhanced individuals showed productivity increases of up to 300% over baseline human performance. Agricultural worlds reported similar improvements in crop yields and livestock management. The economic benefits were so significant that planetary governors began actively recruiting the enhanced individuals for critical positions, unknowingly placing key infrastructure under the control of Genestealer hybrids. The religious movements that emerged among the affected populations provided another layer of camouflage for the infiltration. The enhanced individuals displayed intense spiritual devotion, but their faith focused on concepts of genetic perfection and biological unity, rather than the traditional Imperial creed. They spoke of a great awakening that would transform humanity into something greater, free from the limitations of individual consciousness. These beliefs were initially dismissed as harmless mysticism, particularly since the adherents remained productive and loyal citizens. The psychological profiles of the affected individuals revealed subtle but significant changes in their thought patterns. Standard Imperial psychological evaluations showed that the enhanced humans displayed reduced individual ambition and increased collective thinking. They demonstrated remarkable ability to work together toward common goals, but showed decreased interest in personal advancement or recognition. This collective mentality was initially interpreted as an admirable form of selflessness, but it actually represented the first stages of integration into the Tyranid hive mind. The communication networks established by the hybrid populations operated through channels that Imperial authorities could not monitor or understand. The enhanced individuals seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of each other's thoughts and intentions, coordinating their activities with minimal verbal communication. This apparent telepathic ability was actually a manifestation of their genetic connection to the approaching Tyranid hive fleets, allowing them to receive and transmit information across interstellar distances. The military implications of the infiltration became apparent as significant numbers of Imperial Guard recruits began displaying the genetic modifications. These enhanced soldiers demonstrated superior combat performance, but their loyalty patterns were subtly altered. They showed fierce dedication to their fellow enhanced soldiers while displaying decreased emotional attachment to baseline humans. Military psychologists noted that the enhanced troops were more willing to accept casualties among normal humans while going to extraordinary lengths to protect their genetically modified comrades. The investigation launched by the Ordo Xenos to determine the source of the genetic modifications encountered systematic obstruction from the very populations they were trying to help. The enhanced individuals, while outwardly cooperative, consistently provided information that led investigations away from the true source of their modifications. They displayed remarkable skill at misdirection, suggesting that external threats were responsible for the genetic changes while concealing the biological imperatives that drove their own behavior. The contamination of Imperial institutions proceeded through the careful placement of enhanced individuals in positions of authority. Planetary governors, military commanders and religious leaders who displayed the genetic modifications gradually accumulated power and influence. Their enhanced capabilities made them appear to be ideal candidates for leadership roles, but their genetic programming ensured that their decisions would ultimately serve Tyranid interests rather than human ones. The attempted purges of the affected populations revealed the true scope of the infiltration. When Imperial authorities finally recognized the threat and attempted to identify and isolate the enhanced individuals, they discovered that the genetic modifications had spread far beyond their initial estimates. In some regions, up to 30% of the population displayed some degree of hybrid ancestry. The logistics of removing so many individuals from their positions would have completely collapsed the local economy and administrative structure. The resistance offered by the hybrid populations, when threatened with exposure, demonstrated their hidden capabilities. The enhanced individuals who had appeared to be model citizens suddenly revealed combat skills and coordination abilities that rivaled those of professional soldiers. They fought with desperate intensity to protect their communities, displaying tactical sophistication that suggested military training despite their civilian backgrounds. More disturbing was their apparent willingness to sacrifice themselves to protect the genetic material of their offspring. The revelation that the genetic modifications were not random mutations but part of a coordinated infiltration strategy sent shockwaves through Imperial command. The scope of the threat was far greater than anyone had imagined, extending across multiple star systems and encompassing millions of individuals. The realization that the Imperium was facing an enemy that could corrupt human genetic material itself challenged every assumption about the nature of the threat they faced. The failed explanations and rationalizations offered by Imperial authorities revealed the limitations of their understanding. The genetic modifications were too sophisticated to be the result of chaos corruption, too widespread to be the work of a single heretical faction, and too beneficial to be dismissed as simple mutation. The true horror was the realization that the infiltration represented a form of biological warfare that operated on timescales far beyond human comprehension, with planning and execution that spanned multiple generations. The nature of Hive Fleet Behemoth defied every tactical manual and strategic assessment in the Imperial archives. As the vast biological armada emerged from the intergalactic void, Imperial observers struggled to comprehend the scale of what they were witnessing. The fleet was not a collection of individual vessels operating in coordination, but a single vast organism distributed across millions of component parts. Each bioship, from the smallest drone-class organism to the massive hive ships that dwarfed Imperial battleships, functioned as a specialized organ within a larger body that spanned light-years of space. The bioships demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life in the vacuum of space. Their hulls were not constructed from metal and ceramite, but grown from living tissue that could adapt and evolve in real time. The creatures possessed their own gravity fields, generated through biological processes that Imperial scientists could not understand. Most disturbing was their apparent immunity to the vacuum of space. They required no atmospheric containment or life support systems, existing equally well in the void between stars and in the heart of planetary atmospheres. The first major engagement between Imperial forces and Hive Fleet Behemoth occurred at the Tyranids system, where Battlefleet Tempestus made its desperate stand against the approaching swarm. Admiral Katachan, commanding from the battleship Emperor's Wrath, deployed his forces according to established void warfare doctrine. The Imperial fleet formed a battle line designed to maximize the effectiveness of their macro cannon batteries while maintaining defensive coordination through overlapping void shield coverage. The bioships approached with a coordination that seemed impossible given their vast numbers. Millions of organisms moved in perfect synchronization, their formation shifting and adapting as they encountered Imperial fire. The smaller bioships served as living shields for their larger brethren, absorbing damage that would have crippled conventional vessels while continuing to function. When destroyed, they released clouds of spores and smaller organisms that continued to pose threats to Imperial vessels even after the parent organism had been eliminated. The weapon systems deployed by the bioships operated on principles that violated every understanding of physics and biology. Some creatures launched what appeared to be living artillery, organisms that could navigate through space, seek out targets, and burrow into ship hulls before detonating with devastating effect. Others projected streams of highly corrosive biological material that could eat through void shields and hull plating with terrifying efficiency. The most disturbing were the bioships that seemed to weaponize the very essence of life itself, projecting fields of accelerated biological activity that could cause organic materials to grow and mutate uncontrollably. The boarding actions that followed the initial void engagement revealed the true horror of close-quarters combat with Tyranid organisms. The creatures that invaded Imperial vessels were perfectly adapted for shipboard warfare, possessing claws that could tear through bulkheads and carapaces that could deflect bolter fire. They moved through the cramped corridors of Imperial ships with fluid grace, their alien anatomy allowing them to navigate spaces that would challenge even the most agile human warriors. The psychological impact of facing Tyranid warriors in close combat proved as devastating as their physical capabilities. Imperial Guard troops, veterans of campaigns against Chaos Space Marines and Orc warbands, found themselves facing enemies that operated according to no comprehensible logic. The creatures showed no fear, no individual self-preservation instincts, and no concern for casualties. They attacked with mechanical precision, each organism perfectly coordinated with its fellows in pursuit of objectives that served the greater biological imperative. The adaptive nature of Tyranid combat tactics became apparent as the engagement progressed. Imperial weapons that proved effective against the first wave of bioships found their targets increasingly resistant to the same attacks. The creatures seemed to learn from their casualties, developing countermeasures for Imperial tactics with frightening speed. Las cannon batteries that had successfully penetrated bioship hulls found their subsequent shots absorbed by newly evolved offensive measures. Torpedo salvos were countered by point defense organisms that emerged from the bioship's surfaces like antibodies responding to infection. The scale of the Tyranid assault overwhelmed Imperial defensive doctrine. The fleet's tactical manuals had been developed for engagements involving dozens or hundreds of enemy vessels, not the millions of bioships that comprised Hive Fleet Behemoth. Imperial targeting systems, designed to track and engage conventional starships, struggled to cope with the sheer number of targets. The bioship's ability to reproduce and replace their numbers during combat meant that destroying individual organisms had minimal impact on the fleet's overall capabilities. The logistics of the Tyranid advance revealed the true scope of the threat. Unlike conventional fleets that required supply lines and maintenance facilities, the bioships were entirely self-sufficient. They could repair battle damage using their own biological processes, manufacture ammunition from raw materials absorbed from space debris, and even reproduce new organisms to replace losses. This independence from external support made them impossible to defeat through traditional strategic warfare. The casualty rates suffered by Imperial forces during the engagement exceeded anything in recorded military history. The Emperor's Wrath lost 90% of its crew complement within the first 6 hours of combat, while the accompanying cruiser squadrons suffered similar losses. The few survivors reported that the bioships seemed to prioritize the capture of Imperial personnel over their destruction, suggesting that the creatures valued human genetic material for reasons that Imperial command could not comprehend. The intelligence gathered from the engagement revealed that Hive Fleet Behemoth was not simply a military force, but a complex ecosystem in motion. The bioships contain not only warrior organisms, but vast populations of creatures specialized for different functions. Some served as living factories, producing new organisms and weapons as needed. Others functioned as biological research laboratories, analyzing captured genetic material and developing new adaptations. The entire fleet was engaged in constant evolution, becoming more dangerous with each encounter. The psychic implications of the Tyranid presence became fully apparent during the prolonged engagement. The shadow in the warp, which had been expanding gradually across the Eastern Fringe, suddenly intensified to unprecedented levels. Imperial psychers within the combat zone reported complete loss of their abilities, while some suffered permanent psychological damage from exposure to the alien consciousness. The effect was so severe that astropathic communication became impossible across vast regions of space. The coordination displayed by the bioships suggested a level of intelligence that operated on scales incomprehensible to human minds. Organisms separated by millions of kilometers responded to tactical changes with perfect synchronization, as if they shared a single consciousness. This coordination extended to the smallest details of combat, with individual bioships adapting their behavior to support strategies that encompassed the entire fleet. The implications were staggering. The Imperium was facing not just a military force, but a single vast mind that could think with millions of bodies simultaneously. The retreat of the surviving Imperial forces from the Tyran system marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. The few vessels that escaped carried reports that would fundamentally alter Imperial understanding of the threat they faced. The Tyranids were not simply another xeno-species to be catalogued and countered, but a form of life that operated on principles completely alien to human experience. They represented not just a military threat, but a challenge to the very concept of individual existence. The catastrophic losses suffered at Tyran forced Imperial command to abandon centuries of established military doctrine and embrace methods that would have been considered heretical under normal circumstances. The scale of the Tyranid threat demanded responses that pushed the boundaries of Imperial technology, morality, and sanity. The Adeptus Mechanicus, working in unprecedented cooperation with the Ordo Xenos, began developing weapons and strategies specifically designed to counter biological warfare on a galactic scale. The first desperate innovation was the development of anti-biological weaponry that targeted the fundamental processes of life itself. The Mechanicus created virus bombs designed to disrupt the cellular structure of living organisms, while the Imperial Navy experimented with radiation weapons that could sterilize entire planets. These weapons violated the traditional Imperial preference for capturing and colonizing enemy worlds. But the Tyranid threat left no room for such concerns. The biomass that sustained the Hive fleets had to be denied, regardless of the cost to human civilization. The Exterminatus protocols, previously reserved for the most extreme cases of chaos corruption, became routine responses to Tyranid incursions. Entire star systems were sterilized through cyclonic torpedo bombardment, their populations sacrificed to prevent the biomass from falling into enemy hands. The moral implications of these actions were staggering. Billions of loyal Imperial citizens died not from enemy action, but from their own government's attempts to deny resources to the invaders. The psychological impact on Imperial forces was severe, as they were forced to destroy the very worlds they had sworn to protect. The biological warfare initiatives undertaken by the Mechanicus pushed the boundaries of Imperial technology into forbidden territory. Magos Biologist teams attempted to develop pathogens that could target Tyranid organisms specifically, using captured genetic material to create targeted biological weapons. These experiments required the study of living Tyranid specimens, exposing Imperial researchers to the risk of genetic contamination. Several research facilities were lost when their containment systems failed, with entire installations being consumed by rapidly evolving Tyranid organisms. The technological arms race between Imperial forces and the adapting Tyranids led to increasingly exotic weapons systems. The Mechanicus developed plasma weapons that could burn at temperatures hot enough to disrupt biological processes at the molecular level. They created gravitational weapons that could crush living tissue regardless of its resilience. Most controversially, they began experimenting with warp-based weapons that could target the psychic connections between Tyranid organisms, attempting to disrupt the hive mind itself. The alliance between different Imperial factions, normally prevented by bureaucratic rivalry and doctrinal differences, became necessary for survival. The Adeptus Mechanicus shared technology with the Imperial Navy, while the Ordo Xenos provided intelligence to the Astra Militarum. Even the Space Marines, traditionally independent in their operations, began coordinating closely with other Imperial forces. This unprecedented cooperation led to tactical innovations that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The recruitment policies of the Imperial Guard were modified to address the massive casualties inflicted by Tyranid combat. The traditional standards for military service were relaxed, allowing the conscription of individuals who would normally be considered unfit for duty. Penal legions were expanded to include not just criminals but entire populations from worlds threatened by Tyranid advance. The quality of individual soldiers decreased, but the quantity of available troops increased dramatically. The industrial capacity of the Imperium was converted to total war production with unprecedented speed. Forge worlds that had previously manufactured civilian goods were retooled to produce military equipment. Agricultural worlds were converted to produce nutrients for military rations rather than diverse foodstuffs. The civilian economy was essentially sacrificed to support the military effort, with entire planetary populations reduced to subsistence levels to free resources for the war. The psychological warfare techniques developed to counter Tyranid infiltration required methods that challenged Imperial values. The Ordo Xenos developed screening procedures that examined Imperial citizens for signs of genetic modification, often requiring invasive medical procedures and genetic analysis. Entire populations were subjected to loyalty tests that included exposure to captured Tyranid organisms, with those who showed any signs of positive response being immediately eliminated. The paranoia generated by these measures was almost as destructive as the original threat. The sacrifice of individual worlds to create strategic advantages became standard Imperial policy. Planets were abandoned, not because they could not be defended, but because their loss would serve the greater strategic goal of denying biomass to the enemy. The populations of these worlds were either evacuated or eliminated, depending on the available resources and time constraints. The moral cost of these decisions was enormous, but the alternative was the consumption of entire sectors by the advancing hive fleets. The development of specialized anti-Tyranid Space Marine chapters represented the most extreme adaptation of Imperial military doctrine. These forces were trained specifically for biological warfare, equipped with weapons designed to counter living enemies, and indoctrinated with knowledge of Tyranid capabilities that would have been considered dangerous for normal troops. The Death Watch, created specifically to combat Xenos threats, became the template for these specialized forces. The experimental weapons created to counter Tyranid adaptation included devices that violated Imperial understanding of physics and biology. The Mechanicus developed weapons that could target the quantum processes underlying cellular function, essentially causing living matter to cease existing at the subatomic level. They created ammunition that could evolve and adapt in real time, attempting to match the adaptive capabilities of Tyranid organisms. Some of these weapons were so dangerous that they posed almost as much threat to their users as to the enemy. The point of no return was reached when Imperial command realized that conventional victory was impossible. The Tyranids could not be defeated through traditional military means. They were too numerous, too adaptable, and too alien for standard Imperial tactics. The only hope was to deny them the resources they needed to continue their advance, even if this meant sacrificing entire regions of the galaxy. The decision to make Macragge the final stand was not based on confidence in victory, but on the recognition that retreat was no longer an option. The preparations for the defense of Macragge represented the ultimate commitment of Imperial resources to a single battle. The Ultramarines' fortress world was reinforced with weapons and defenses that had never been deployed on such a scale. The population was evacuated or recruited into the defense, with every citizen becoming either a soldier or a resource to be denied to the enemy. The planet itself was transformed into a weapon, with its entire surface converted to military purposes. The technological innovations required for the defense of Macragge pushed Imperial science to its absolute limits. The Mechanics deployed experimental weapons that had never been tested under combat conditions. They created defensive systems that operated on principles that challenged fundamental understanding of physics and biology. The entire planet became a laboratory for testing the most extreme responses to the Tyranid threat, with the survival of the galaxy hanging in the balance. The coordinated uprising that erupted across the Eastern Fringe on the eve of Hive Fleet Behemoth's final approach to Macragge revealed the true scope and sophistication of the Genestealer infiltration. What Imperial authorities had dismissed as isolated incidents of genetic deviation suddenly coalesced into a galaxy-spanning conspiracy that had been developing for over a century. The timing was no coincidence. The psychic signal that triggered the uprising was transmitted through the same bioneural networks that connected the hybrid populations to the approaching hive mind. The revolt began simultaneously on 47 worlds across 12 star systems, with each outbreak following an identical pattern that suggested central coordination. On the mining world of Gehenna Prime, the enhanced workers who had been celebrated for their productivity suddenly seized control of the orbital defense platforms. Within hours, the planet's entire defensive network was under hybrid control, its weapons turned against the very Imperial forces they had been built to protect. The speed and precision of the takeover indicated that the rebels had been planning their actions for decades. The betrayal was most devastating where it was least expected. On the Agra world of Bol Secundus, Governor Militant Thaddeus Vex discovered that his own daughter, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Vex, had been genetically compromised for over a decade. The revelation came when she executed her own father's loyal aides during a strategic planning session, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to eliminate 6 veteran officers before they could react. The psychological impact of such personal betrayal rippled through the Imperial command structure, destroying trust between officers who had served together for decades. The scope of the infiltration within the Imperial Guard proved particularly catastrophic. Entire regiments that had been recruited from hybrid populations revealed their true nature when the uprising began. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops, considered one of the most reliable regiments in the Eastern Fringe, turned their weapons on their own officers and seized control of the strategic fortress world of Prandium. The regiment's enhanced soldiers demonstrated combat capabilities that exceeded even their previous exceptional performance, suggesting that they had been deliberately restraining their abilities to avoid suspicion. The communication networks that had been compromised by hybrid infiltration became weapons of psychological warfare. False orders were transmitted through official Imperial channels, directing loyal forces into ambushes or ordering them to abandon defensive positions. The hybrids' intimate knowledge of Imperial protocols and procedures allowed them to create deceptions that were virtually indistinguishable from legitimate communications. Naval vessels following what they believed were authentic orders found themselves isolated and vulnerable when the true nature of their missions became apparent. The military betrayal extended to the highest levels of command. Admiral Kronos, commanding the reserve fleet stationed at Baka, was revealed to be a 4th-generation hybrid when he ordered his vessels to stand down rather than engage the approaching bioships. The discovery came too late to prevent the loss of 3 battle barges and their entire Space Marine contingents, who had trusted their naval support to provide covering fire during a crucial boarding action. The Admiral's genetic modifications had been so subtle that they had evaded detection for over 40 years of distinguished service. The civilian populations on hybrid-controlled worlds demonstrated a coordination that defied explanation through conventional psychology. Entire cities moved with a single purpose, their inhabitants working together with mechanical efficiency to support the Tyranid advance. The transformation was so complete that families turned against members who lacked the genetic modifications, children betraying parents and spouses eliminating each other with emotionless precision. The breakdown of human social bonds was perhaps more disturbing than the physical violence that accompanied it. The industrial sabotage that preceded the uprising had been years in the making. Power plants that had operated flawlessly for centuries suddenly suffered catastrophic failures, their hybrid operators having installed subtle modifications that could be triggered at the appropriate moment. Weapons factories exploded as their manufactured ammunition was detonated by hidden charges, while spaceports were crippled by the systematic destruction of their launch and docking facilities. The economic infrastructure of entire sectors collapsed within hours. The intelligence value of the hybrid infiltration became apparent as Imperial forces found themselves facing enemies who knew their every tactical doctrine and strategic capability. The Tyranids demonstrated detailed knowledge of Imperial weapon systems, adapting their bioships to counter specific types of ammunition and defensive measures. They anticipated Imperial tactical responses with uncanny accuracy, positioning their forces to exploit weaknesses that should have been known only to the highest levels of Imperial command. The psychological warfare aspects of the betrayal were calculated to maximize despair and confusion among loyal Imperial forces. The hybrids deliberately targeted officers and officials who were most trusted and respected, ensuring that their revelation as enemies would have the greatest impact on morale. The transformation of beloved leaders into genetic abominations created a crisis of faith that paralyzed decision-making at crucial moments. The selective nature of the genetic modifications revealed the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that the Tyranids possessed. The hybrids retained enough of their original personalities to maintain their relationships and positions, but their fundamental loyalties had been altered at the genetic level. They genuinely believed they were working for the betterment of humanity, seeing their betrayal as a necessary step in humanity's evolution toward a higher form of existence. The religious movements that had been growing among the hybrid populations suddenly revealed their true purpose. The Great Awakening that they had preached was not a spiritual transformation, but a biological one, the moment when humanity would be absorbed into the Tyranid collective consciousness. The theological justifications they provided for their actions were so sophisticated that they convinced many normal humans to support their cause, believing that they were witnessing the next stage of human evolution. The coordination between different hybrid populations across vast distances demonstrated the existence of a communication network that operated outside normal space-time. Uprisings on worlds separated by hundreds of light-years began within minutes of each other, despite the impossibility of faster-than-light communication through conventional means. The hybrids had somehow tapped into the same bio-neural pathways that connected the approaching hive fleets, allowing them to coordinate their actions across galactic distances. The attempted counter-betrayal by loyal Imperial forces revealed the true extent of the compromise. When Governor Militant Corvin attempted to arrest suspected hybrids on the fortress world of Calth, he discovered that over 30% of his own staff carried genetic modifications. The purge he ordered led to a civil war that crippled the planet's defenses just as the Tyranid advance reached its borders. The irony was that the attempt to root out betrayal had created the very vulnerability that the betrayers had been working to achieve. The final revelation of the betrayal's scope came when Imperial Command realized that the hybrid networks had been feeding intelligence to the Tyranids for decades. Every Imperial tactical manual, every strategic assessment, every technological innovation had been transmitted to the approaching hive fleets through channels that Imperial security had never suspected. The Tyranids were not just adapting to Imperial tactics in real time, they had been preparing for this war for over a century. The psychological impact of the betrayal on the surviving Imperial forces was as devastating as the physical losses. The realization that trusted comrades, beloved leaders, and even family members had been genetically programmed to serve an alien agenda challenged the fundamental assumptions about human nature that underpinned Imperial civilization. The betrayal was not just military or political, but existential, calling into question the very concept of individual identity and free will. The infrastructure breakdown that followed the coordinated hybrid uprising created a cascade effect that paralyzed Imperial response across the Eastern Fringe. The carefully maintained supply lines that had sustained Imperial forces for centuries were severed not by enemy action, but by the systematic sabotage of trusted personnel. Forge worlds that had produced weapons and equipment for the war effort suddenly found their production facilities crippled by explosions and mechanical failures orchestrated by hybrid technicians who had worked in those facilities for decades. The communication networks that bound the Imperium together suffered simultaneous failures across multiple sectors. Astropathic relay stations, staffed by personnel who had passed every loyalty test and genetic screening, suddenly went silent as their hybrid operators either destroyed the facilities or transmitted false information designed to confuse Imperial command. The result was a communication breakdown that left Imperial forces operating in complete isolation, unable to coordinate their responses or call for reinforcements. The collapse of the banking and trade systems that supported Imperial logistics proved as devastating as any military defeat. Hybrid infiltrators, who had worked their way into positions within the administratum, initiated a series of financial manipulations that crippled the economic infrastructure of entire sectors. Supply contracts were cancelled, payment authorizations were revoked, and critical resources were redirected to support the advancing Tyranid forces. The complexity of Imperial bureaucracy, normally a strength, became a vulnerability as the system's own procedures were turned against it. The refugee crisis that erupted as hybrid worlds fell to the Tyranids overwhelmed the remaining Imperial infrastructure. Millions of civilians fled toward the core worlds of Ultramar, carrying with them not just their possessions, but also the genetic contamination that had doomed their homeworlds. The refugee camps became breeding grounds for further hybrid infiltration, as the genetic modifications could be passed through contact with bodily fluids and genetic material. The humanitarian crisis became a biological warfare catastrophe. The military implications of the infrastructure collapse became apparent as Imperial Guard regiments found themselves cut off from resupply and reinforcement. The 12th Armored Division, defending the approaches to Macragge, discovered that their ammunition supplies had been deliberately contaminated with acidic compounds that would destroy their weapons after prolonged use. The sabotage was so sophisticated that it had gone undetected for months, only becoming apparent when the division's tanks began suffering catastrophic weapon failures during combat operations. The Fortress World strategy, that had been the cornerstone of Imperial defense doctrine, proved inadequate when the worlds themselves were compromised from within. Kolth, one of the most heavily fortified planets in the Ultramar system, fell not to external assault, but to internal rebellion. The hybrid populations that had been growing within the fortress cities suddenly seized control of the defensive systems, turning the planet's own weapons against its defenders. The psychological impact of losing such a seemingly impregnable stronghold sent shockwaves through Imperial command. The space lanes that connected the Imperial worlds became death traps as hybrid crews aboard merchant vessels, and even military transports revealed their true nature. The cargo hauler Blessed Abundance detonated its reactor while docked at the naval station orbiting Talisar, destroying 3 cruisers and their entire crews. The incident was initially attributed to mechanical failure, but investigation revealed that the entire crew had been genetically modified and had deliberately sacrificed themselves to inflict maximum damage on Imperial forces. The coordination between the collapsing infrastructure and the advancing Tyranid forces demonstrated a level of strategic planning that spanned decades. Each system failure was timed to coincide with the arrival of bioships in the affected region, ensuring that Imperial forces would be at their most vulnerable when the enemy arrived. The precision of this coordination suggested that the hybrid infiltrators had been receiving detailed intelligence about the Hive fleet's movements through their genetic connection to the Tyranid hive mind. The rapid loss of orbital defenses around key worlds created gaps in the Imperial defensive network that the Tyranids exploited with devastating efficiency. The defense platforms around Ix, protected by void shields that had withstood chaos assaults for centuries, were suddenly vulnerable when their hybrid operators lowered the shields and disabled the weapons systems. The Tyranid bioships that had been struggling to penetrate the defenses suddenly found themselves facing unprotected targets. The resource depletion that resulted from the infrastructure collapse forced Imperial commanders to make increasingly desperate choices. The decision to abandon the outer worlds of the Ultramar system was made not because they could not be defended, but because the resources needed to maintain their defenses were no longer available. The industrial capacity that had supported the Imperial war effort was either destroyed or under enemy control, leaving the remaining forces to fight with whatever equipment they could salvage from the ruins. The morale collapse among Imperial forces was as devastating as the physical infrastructure failures. The realization that their own supply lines, communication networks and support systems had been compromised by genetic infiltration created a crisis of confidence that paralyzed decision-making at every level. Officers who had commanded with authority for decades suddenly found themselves questioning every order, every report, and every piece of intelligence they received. The breakdown of the civil administration that supported Imperial military operations created chaos that the Tyranids exploited with mechanical precision. Planetary governors who had been coordinating defensive efforts suddenly found themselves unable to access the resources they needed to maintain their forces. The bureaucratic systems that had managed the complex logistics of galactic warfare simply ceased to function. leaving military commanders to operate without the support infrastructure that had sustained Imperial forces for millennia. The concentration of remaining Imperial forces around Macragge represented not a strategic choice, but the collapse of all other options. The fortress world had become the last place where Imperial infrastructure remained intact, the last location where communication with the wider Imperium was possible, and the last hope for organizing effective resistance against the Tyranid advance. The decision to make the final stand there was driven by desperation rather than confidence, as the cascading failures across the Eastern Fringe had eliminated all other alternatives. The psychological impact of the collapse on the civilian populations was as important as its military implications. The breakdown of the systems that had maintained order and stability for centuries created a sense of apocalyptic despair that made populations more susceptible to hybrid influence. The promise of unity and purpose offered by the genetic modifications seemed increasingly attractive to populations who had lost faith in the Imperial system's ability to protect them. The final phase of the collapse saw the abandonment of centuries-old Imperial strongholds as their defenders recognized that continued resistance was impossible. The fortress monasteries of the Space Marines, the orbital stations of the Imperial Navy, and the command centers of the Imperial Guard were evacuated as their supporting infrastructure failed. The retreat to Macragge represented not just a military withdrawal, but the collapse of Imperial civilization across an entire region of the galaxy. The defense of Macragge represented the ultimate test of Imperial military doctrine against an enemy that operated according to no comprehensible logic. The Ultramarines' fortress world had been transformed into the most heavily fortified position in the galaxy. Its entire surface converted to military purposes in preparation for the final confrontation with Hive Fleet Behemoth. Every continent had been studded with orbital defense platforms, macro cannon batteries and void shield generators, while the planet's population had been either evacuated or recruited into the defense forces. The approach of the Hive Fleet was visible from the planet's surface as a shadow that blotted out entire star fields. The bioships numbered in the millions, their living hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that created a horrifying display of alien beauty against the darkness of space. The largest of these creatures dwarfed even the mightiest Imperial battleships, their kilometers-long forms bristling with weapon symbiotes and spawning chambers that could disgorge millions of smaller organisms. Chapter Master Marneus Kalgar, commanding the defense from the fortress of Hera, had assembled a force that represented the pinnacle of Imperial military capability. The entire Ultramarines chapter was present, along with elements from 6 other Space Marine chapters that had answered the call for aid. The Imperial Guard regiments numbered in the hundreds, drawn from across the galaxy to participate in what everyone understood might be the final battle for humanity's survival. The void battle that preceded the planetary assault lasted for 17 days and nights, with the darkness of space lit by the continuous exchange of fire between the opposing forces. The Imperial Navy, under the command of Admiral Wrath, deployed every ship available in the sector, creating a defensive formation that stretched across the entire Macragge system. The bioships approached with methodical precision, their formations shifting and adapting as they encountered Imperial fire with a coordination that suggested a single vast intelligence directing their movements. The opening salvos of the engagement demonstrated the terrible evolution that the Tyranids had undergone since their first encounters with Imperial forces. The bioships had developed countermeasures for every weapon system in the Imperial arsenal, their living hulls now resistant to las cannon fire and macro cannon shells. The void shields that had protected Imperial vessels for millennia proved useless against Tyranid bioweapons that could phase through energy barriers and attack the ship's hulls directly. The adaptive nature of the Tyranid assault became apparent as the battle progressed. The bioships that were damaged by Imperial fire did not simply repair themselves, they evolved, developing new defensive capabilities that made them immune to the weapons that had injured them. The process was so rapid that Imperial gunners found their targets becoming more resilient with each passing hour, forcing them to constantly adjust their tactics and weapon configurations. The boarding actions that followed the initial void engagement brought the war to a personal level that tested the courage and skill of every Imperial defender. The Tyranid organisms that invaded the Imperial vessels were perfectly adapted for shipboard combat, their alien anatomy allowing them to navigate the cramped corridors and maintenance shafts with fluid grace. The creatures moved with mechanical precision, each organism coordinating perfectly with its fellows in pursuit of objectives that served the greater biological imperative. The defense of the orbital platforms around Macragge, provided some of the most heroic moments in Imperial military history. The weapon stations, manned by volunteers who knew they would not survive the battle, continued firing even as Tyranid organisms swarmed through their corridors. The sacrifice of these defenders bought precious time for the planetary defenses to prepare, their deaths serving as a testament to the courage that had sustained the Imperium for 10,000 years. The planetary assault began when the first wave of Tyranid landing organisms breached the atmosphere of Macragge. The creatures fell like meteors, their biological heat shields protecting them from the intense friction of atmospheric entry. The landing zones had been carefully selected based on intelligence gathered during decades of infiltration, targeting areas where the planetary defenses were weakest and the terrain most suitable for the deployment of large bioforms. The ground war that followed tested every aspect of Imperial military doctrine against an enemy that operated according to no comprehensible strategy. The Tyranid swarms moved with perfect coordination, their attacks precisely timed to exploit weaknesses in the Imperial defensive lines. The creatures demonstrated an intimate knowledge of Imperial tactics, anticipating defensive maneuvers and positioning themselves to counter expected responses. The Polar Fortress, the strongest defensive position on Macragge, became the focal point of the most intense fighting. The massive structure, built into the planet's northern polar cap, housed the command facilities and strategic weapons that were essential to the planet's defense. The fortress had been designed to withstand siege warfare for centuries, its walls capable of resisting even the most devastating bombardment. However, the Tyranids did not attempt to breach the walls through conventional assault. Instead, they began to undermine the fortress's foundations, using specialized organisms that could burrow through solid rock. The duel between Chapter Master Calgar and the creature later identified as the Swarmlord represented the climactic moment of the entire war. The Tyranid bioconstruct, standing nearly 4 meters tall and equipped with 4 massive bone swords, embodied the tactical genius of the hive mind in physical form. The creature moved with impossible speed and precision, its attacks coordinated with the mathematical perfection that characterized all Tyranid operations. The battle between the two commanders lasted for over an hour, with neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Calgar's power fists, weapons that could pulverize even the heaviest armor, were matched by the Swarmlord's bone swords, which could part molecular bonds with surgical precision. The fight ranged across the fortress's command center, with both combatants using their environment as weapons while their respective forces battled around them. The turning point of the duel came when Calgar realized that the Swarmlord was not fighting to win, but to learn. The creature was studying his combat techniques, analyzing his tactical responses, and transmitting this information to the greater hive mind. The Chapter Master's victory came not through superior combat skill, but through the recognition that he was facing an enemy that valued knowledge more than individual survival. The technological solution that ultimately disrupted the Tyranid coordination was developed by the Tech Marines of the Ultramarines chapter working in cooperation with the Adeptus Mechanicus. The device, a psychic resonance generator, was designed to interfere with the bio-neural networks that connected the Tyranid organisms to their hive mind. The weapon created a feedback loop that caused the creatures to lose their coordination, forcing them to operate as individuals rather than as components of a larger organism. The deployment of the psychic weapon marked the beginning of the end for the Tyranid assault. The creatures that had moved with perfect coordination suddenly found themselves isolated and confused, their tactical superiority evaporating as the hive mind's influence was disrupted. The bioships in orbit began to drift aimlessly, their crews no longer able to coordinate their movements or respond to changing battlefield conditions. The biomass denial strategy that prevented the Tyranids from consuming Macragge's population was implemented through the systematic destruction of the planet's biosphere. Imperial forces used flame weapons and chemical agents to sterilize vast areas of the planet's surface, denying the invaders the organic matter they needed to sustain their assault. The sacrifice was enormous. Entire ecosystems were destroyed and millions of square kilometers of fertile land were rendered uninhabitable. The final moments of the battle saw the Tyranid forces retreating not in defeat, but in recognition that the cost of victory had become too high. The hive mind calculated that the remaining biomass on Macragge was insufficient to justify the continued expenditure of resources, and the surviving bioships began to withdraw from the system. The victory was not achieved through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the Imperial forces' willingness to sacrifice everything to deny their enemies the resources they needed. The aftermath of the battle left Macragge a devastated wasteland, its surface scarred by the most intense fighting in Imperial history. The casualty figures were staggering, as over 90% of the defending forces had been killed or wounded, while the civilian population had been almost entirely evacuated or destroyed. The victory had been achieved at a cost that challenged the very concept of military success, raising questions about whether such triumphs were worth the price paid to achieve them. The silence that followed the withdrawal of Hive Fleet Behemoth was more disturbing than the cacophony of battle that had preceded it. Macragge, once a jewel of the Ultramar realm, lay in ruins beneath a sky stained with the smoke of burning biomatter and the ashes of destroyed cities. The planet's surface was scarred by craters where bioships had fallen, while vast areas remained contaminated with Tyranid spores that defied all attempts at sterilization. The victory had been achieved, but at a cost that challenged the very definition of success. The casualty assessment revealed the true scope of the devastation. Of the original population of 12 million Imperial citizens, fewer than 400,000 remained alive. The Ultramarines chapter had been reduced to barely company strength, with many of its most veteran warriors lost in the final battles. The Imperial Guard regiments that had participated in the defense were effectively eliminated as fighting forces, their survivors too traumatized and depleted to continue military service. The Space Marine chapters that had answered the call for aid had suffered similarly catastrophic losses. The biological contamination left by the Tyranid assault presented challenges that went beyond simple reconstruction. Every surface, every structure, and every piece of equipment had been exposed to alien organisms that continued to pose threats even after the main force had withdrawn. Tyranid spores, embedded in the planet's soil and atmosphere, showed signs of continuing evolution and adaptation. The Adeptus Mechanicus teams sent to assess the contamination reported that some of the organisms appeared to be developing into new forms of life, potentially creating permanent changes to the planet's biosphere. The psychological impact on the survivors was as devastating as the physical destruction. Imperial Guard soldiers who had witnessed the consumption of their comrades by Tyranid organisms showed symptoms of what medical officers termed existential trauma, a condition that went beyond simple battle shock to encompass a fundamental questioning of the nature of existence itself. Many veterans reported nightmares of being absorbed into the hive mind, while others developed obsessive behaviors related to maintaining individual identity. The intelligence gathered from captured Tyranid organisms revealed disturbing truths about the nature of the enemy. The bioships that had been destroyed in the fighting were found to contain genetic material from hundreds of different species, suggesting that the Tyranids had consumed entire ecosystems from across the galaxy. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some of the genetic material was recognizably human, indicating that the hive fleets had been harvesting human populations for far longer than Imperial authorities had realized. The strategic implications of the victory became apparent as Imperial Command attempted to assess the broader situation. The defeat of Hive Fleet Behemoth had been achieved through tactics that could not be replicated on a galactic scale. The resources expended in the defense of Macragge had been so enormous that similar preparations could not be made for other threatened worlds. The victory had been won through the sacrifice of an entire sector's military capability, leaving the surrounding regions vulnerable to future attacks. The reconstruction efforts began immediately, but they were hampered by the ongoing threat of Tyranid contamination. Engineering teams discovered that many of the planet's structures had been altered at the molecular level by exposure to Tyranid bioacids, making them unsafe for occupation. The water supplies had been contaminated with organisms that could survive standard purification procedures, while the soil showed signs of genetic modification that made it unsuitable for normal agriculture. The emergence of Genestealer cults in the surrounding systems revealed that the Tyranid threat had not been eliminated, merely contained. The hybrid populations that had been activated during the main assault continued to pose threats across the region, their genetic programming intact despite the defeat of the Hive Fleet. The cults showed signs of adapting to the new situation, developing new strategies for infiltration and sabotage that took advantage of the weakened Imperial defenses. The technological innovations developed during the defense of Macragge provided valuable insights into anti-Tyranid warfare, but they also revealed the limitations of Imperial science when faced with a truly alien enemy. The psychic resonance generators that had disrupted the hive mind's coordination were found to be effective only at short range and required enormous amounts of energy to operate. The biological weapons that had been used to deny biomass to the Tyranids had also destroyed much of the planet's natural ecosystem, creating environmental problems that would persist for centuries. The communication networks that had been disrupted by the Shadow and the Warp slowly began to recover, but the reconnection with the wider Imperium brought disturbing news. Reports from across the galaxy indicated that the Tyranid threat was far more widespread than anyone had imagined. The defeat of Hive Fleet Behemoth had been only the beginning of a conflict that would continue for generations, with new Hive fleets approaching from the intergalactic void. The political implications of the victory were as complex as its military consequences. The Ultramarines chapter, despite their heroic defense of their homeworld, had been so weakened that they could no longer fulfill their traditional role as one of the Imperium's premier military forces. The power vacuum created by their losses led to political instability across the Ultramar realm, with various Imperial factions competing for influence in the region. The medical treatment of the survivors revealed the insidious nature of Tyranid biological warfare. Many of the defending forces had been exposed to organisms that caused genetic modifications at the cellular level, creating long-term health problems that challenged Imperial medical science. The treatments required to counter these effects were often as dangerous as the original contamination, leaving many veterans permanently disabled or requiring constant medical supervision. The economic impact of the war extended far beyond the immediate destruction. The resources that had been devoted to the defense of Macragge represented centuries of accumulated wealth and production capacity. The Forge Worlds that had produced the weapons and equipment for the defense had been forced to operate at maximum capacity for years, exhausting their stockpiles and wearing out their manufacturing equipment. The cost of replacement and reconstruction would burden the Imperial economy for decades. The establishment of quarantine protocols around the affected systems created a new category of Imperial territory. Regions that remained under Imperial control but were considered too dangerous for normal civilian occupation. These quarantine zones required constant military supervision and specialized equipment to monitor for signs of ongoing Tyranid activity. The resources required to maintain these protocols diverted significant military assets from other threats. The veterans of the Macragge defense became a new class of Imperial citizen, their experiences having changed them in ways that made integration into normal society difficult. Many were recruited into specialized anti-Tyranid units, their knowledge of alien tactics making them valuable despite their psychological trauma. Others were assigned to research facilities, where their first-hand experience with Tyranid organisms provided insights that could not be gained through conventional study. The realization that the victory at Macragge had been achieved through methods that were unrepeatable on a galactic scale created a crisis of confidence within Imperial military command. The tactics that had proven effective against Hive Fleet Behemoth required resources and coordination that simply could not be maintained across the vast distances of the Imperium. The victory had been won through sacrifice and determination, but it had also revealed the limitations of Imperial military doctrine when faced with an enemy that operated according to completely alien principles. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Macragge thus represented both a triumph and a tragedy for the Imperium. The victory had been achieved, but at a cost that questioned whether such success could be sustained against future threats. The defeat of Hive Fleet Behemoth had bought time for the Imperium to prepare for the greater challenges that lay ahead, but it had also revealed the true scope of the enemy they faced, and the limitations of their ability to resist it. The technological legacy of the First Tyrannic War fundamentally transformed Imperial military doctrine and scientific understanding. The anti-biological weapons developed during the desperate defense of Macragge became the foundation for an entirely new branch of Imperial warfare. The Adeptus Mechanicus established specialized research facilities dedicated to studying Tyranid organisms, with the most secure installations built on dead worlds where containment breaches could not threaten civilian populations. These facilities developed increasingly sophisticated bioweapons, including viral agents designed to target specific Tyranid genetic sequences and chemical compounds that could disrupt the cellular processes of living tissue. The formation of the Deathwatch represented the most significant organizational response to the Tyranid threat. This specialized Space Marine force, drawn from veterans of anti-Xenos campaigns across the galaxy, was equipped with knowledge and weapons specifically designed to counter alien threats. The Deathwatch kill teams became the Imperium's primary response to Tyranid infiltration, their expertise in recognizing and eliminating Genestealer cults proving invaluable in preventing future biological warfare campaigns. The organization's influence extended beyond military operations, as Death Watch veterans were assigned to train Imperial Guard regiments and provide expertise to planetary defense forces. The cultural impact of the Tyrannic Wars created lasting changes in Imperial society that extended far beyond military preparations. The concept of genetic purity, always important in Imperial ideology, became an obsession that affected every aspect of civilian life. Mandatory genetic screening became routine for all Imperial citizens, with sophisticated testing procedures designed to detect even the slightest signs of alien contamination. The psychological impact of these measures was enormous, creating a culture of suspicion and paranoia that fundamentally altered relationships between Imperial citizens. The ongoing conflicts created by the Tyranid presence manifested in ways that challenged traditional Imperial responses to alien threats. Unlike chaos cults, which could be identified through their corrupt practices and blasphemous beliefs, Genestealer cults appeared to be model Imperial communities until the moment of their activation. This led to the development of new investigative techniques and security protocols that emphasized behavioral analysis and genetic monitoring rather than traditional signs of heresy. The Ordo Xenos expanded its operations significantly, establishing permanent monitoring stations throughout the galaxy to watch for signs of Tyranid infiltration. The hidden survivors and remnants of the original Hive fleet continued to pose threats for decades after the main battle. Splinter organisms, cut off from the hive mind's coordination during the final battle, adapted to independent existence and began to reproduce using local resources. These creatures, while smaller and less coordinated than the original Tyranid forms, retained much of their adaptive capability and proved difficult to eliminate. Entire Imperial Guard regiments were deployed to hunt down these survivors, leading to a form of guerrilla warfare that could continue for centuries on affected worlds. The strategic implications of the Tyranid presence extended to the highest levels of Imperial planning and resource allocation. The realization that the galaxy faced a threat that could not be permanently defeated led to fundamental changes in Imperial grand strategy. Resources that had previously been devoted to expansion and exploration were redirected toward defensive preparations and the development of anti-biological warfare capabilities. The entire Eastern Fringe was transformed into a militarized zone, with every world required to maintain defensive capabilities sufficient to delay a Tyranid assault long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The economic consequences of the perpetual Tyranid threat created new industries and trading patterns throughout the Imperium. The demand for specialized anti-biological equipment led to the establishment of new forge worlds dedicated to producing flame weapons, chemical protective gear, and biomonitoring devices. Trading companies specialized in supplying isolated worlds that might be cut off by Tyranid shadow effects, while insurance markets developed new categories of coverage for biological warfare damage. The entire Imperial economy was restructured around the assumption that Tyranid attacks would continue indefinitely. The religious implications of the Tyranid threat led to theological debates that challenged fundamental Imperial beliefs about humanity's place in the universe. The ecclesiarchy struggled to reconcile the existence of a threat that consumed souls along with flesh with traditional Imperial doctrine about the Emperor's protection. New prayers and rituals were developed specifically for protection against biological corruption, while the concept of genetic sanctity became a central tenet of Imperial faith. The threat of absorption into the hive mind created new categories of martyrdom and heroism that were incorporated into Imperial religious teaching. The scientific revolution sparked by Tyranid studies led to breakthroughs in biological and genetic engineering that had implications far beyond military applications. Imperial medical science advanced significantly as researchers worked to understand and counter Tyranid biological weapons. Agricultural techniques were improved to create crops that could resist biological contamination, while new methods of genetic analysis allowed for earlier detection of alien influence. The Adeptus Mechanicus developed entirely new branches of study dedicated to understanding biological technology and its potential applications. The psychological legacy of the Tyrannic Wars created a generation of Imperial citizens who had grown up under the shadow of existential threat. Children born in the aftermath of the wars were raised with an understanding that their individual existence could be extinguished not just through death, but through absorption into an alien consciousness. This created new forms of mental discipline and spiritual practice, as Imperial citizens sought ways to maintain their individual identity against threats that attacked the very concept of selfhood. The intelligence networks established to monitor Tyranid activity became permanent features of Imperial administration. The requirement to maintain constant surveillance for biological threats led to the creation of vast bureaucratic systems dedicated to tracking genetic variations, monitoring communication patterns, and analyzing behavioral data. These systems required enormous resources to maintain, but they became essential for early detection of Tyranid infiltration attempts. The information gathered through these networks also proved valuable for countering other alien threats, leading to improved responses to chaos, corruption, and other forms of subversion. The military doctrines developed in response to the Tyranid threat influenced Imperial responses to all forms of alien contact. The emphasis on rapid response, overwhelming firepower, and the denial of resources to enemies became standard Imperial practice in dealing with any unknown threat. The concept of preemptive strikes against potential enemies was expanded, with Imperial forces authorized to eliminate alien presence before it could establish itself. This aggressive stance led to conflicts with species that might otherwise have been amenable to negotiation or coexistence. The regional fortification programs initiated after the First Tyrannic War created new forms of defensive architecture and urban planning. Entire star systems were restructured to maximize their defensive potential, with civilian populations concentrated in heavily fortified hive cities that could withstand extended siege. Transportation networks were designed to allow rapid evacuation or reinforcement, while industrial facilities were constructed with self-destruct capabilities to prevent their resources from falling into enemy hands. These preparations required enormous investments but became essential for survival in regions threatened by Tyranid activity. The educational systems throughout the Imperium were modified to include training in biological threat recognition and anti-infiltration techniques. Children learned to identify the signs of genetic modification and alien influence as part of their basic education, while advanced students received specialized training in bio-warfare countermeasures. The psychological impact of this education was significant, creating generations of Imperial citizens who viewed biological diversity with suspicion, and who were trained to report any unusual biological phenomena to Imperial authorities. The technological arms race between Imperial forces and evolving Tyranid organisms continued long after the main battles had ended. Each new weapon or defensive measure developed by Imperial scientists was eventually countered by Tyranid adaptation, leading to an endless cycle of innovation and counter-innovation. This technological competition drove rapid advancement in Imperial science but also consumed enormous resources that might otherwise have been used for civilian improvements. The knowledge that any defensive measure was temporary created a culture of constant vigilance and preparation that defined Imperial civilization in the post-Tyrannic era. The current threat assessment regarding the Tyranid menace in the 41st millennium reveals a situation far more complex and terrifying than the relatively straightforward invasion that characterized Hive Fleet Behemoth. Intelligence gathered by the Ordo Xenos indicates that the Milky Way galaxy is now under assault by multiple Hive fleets, each approaching from different vectors and employing distinct tactical doctrines. Hive Fleet Kraken, which arrived in the wake of Behemoth's defeat, demonstrated evolutionary adaptations that suggested the Tyranid species had learned from their previous encounter with Imperial forces. The fleet's bioships were faster, more resilient, and employed biological weapons that had been specifically evolved to counter the defensive measures that had proven effective at Macragge. The emergence of Hive Fleet Leviathan on the galaxy's southern edge has created a multi-front war that stretches Imperial resources beyond their breaking point. This massive armada, estimated to contain over 50 million bioships, represents the largest Tyranid force yet encountered. The fleet's approach has been methodical and systematic, consuming entire star clusters in its advance toward the galactic core. Most disturbing is the evidence that Leviathan has been specifically engineered to counter the lessons learned from previous Tyrannic Wars, incorporating defenses against psychic disruption and showing resistance to the biological weapons that had proven effective against earlier Hive fleets. The impact of the Great Rift's creation on Tyranid invasion patterns has fundamentally altered the strategic situation across the galaxy. The massive warp storm that divides the Imperium has disrupted traditional space lanes and communication networks, but it has also affected the shadow and the warp that accompanies Tyranid advances. Some Hive fleets have demonstrated the ability to use the psychic turbulence created by the rift to mask their approach, while others have shown signs of being repelled or confused by the chaotic energies. The interaction between chaos and Tyranid forces has created new forms of biological horror that challenge both Imperial and alien understanding. The return of Primarch Rabaut Guilliman during the Indomitus Crusade has brought new strategic thinking to the Imperial response to the Tyranid threat. The Primarch's analysis of the situation has led to the development of new defensive doctrines that emphasize mobility and rapid response rather than the fortress world strategies that had characterized previous Imperial approaches. The creation of new Space Marine chapters specifically trained for anti-Tyranid warfare has provided the Imperium with specialized forces capable of responding to biological threats with unprecedented effectiveness. The proliferation of splinter fleets throughout the galaxy has created a situation where Tyranid presence has become a permanent feature of Imperial existence. These smaller hive fleets, numbering in the dozens, operate independently of the main armadas and pose constant threats to isolated worlds and shipping lanes. Their activities have forced the Imperium to maintain anti-Tyranid forces in every sector, creating a drain on military resources that affects the Empire's ability to respond to other threats. The psychological impact of this constant danger has fundamentally altered Imperial civilization, creating a society that exists in a state of permanent biological warfare. The discovery of ancient Eldar prophecies regarding the Great Devourer has provided disturbing insights into the true scope of the Tyranid threat. These texts, some predating the fall of the Eldar Empire, describe encounters with star locusts that consumed entire galaxies before moving on to new feeding grounds. The prophecies suggest that the Tyranid species is far older than Imperial authorities had realized, and that their consumption of the Milky Way is part of a pattern that has been repeated countless times across the universe. The implications of these revelations challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of life in the cosmos. The genetic analysis of captured Tyranid organisms has revealed evidence that suggests the species may have consumed other versions of humanity from different galaxies. DNA sequences that are recognizably human but show significant evolutionary divergence have been identified in bioship samples, indicating that the Tyranids have encountered and absorbed human populations that developed along different evolutionary paths. This discovery has profound implications for Imperial understanding of humanity's place in the universe and raises disturbing questions about the ultimate fate of human civilization. The development of new forms of Genestealer cults that show resistance to traditional detection methods has created ongoing security challenges throughout the Imperium. These evolved cults demonstrate more sophisticated understanding of Imperial psychology and social structures, making their infiltration techniques far more effective than those employed by earlier generations. The discovery of multi-generational cult families that have maintained their cover for centuries, while slowly expanding their influence, has revealed the long-term nature of the Tyranid threat and the patience with which they pursue their goals. The biomass calculations performed by Imperial statisticians paint a grim picture of the galaxy's long-term survival prospects. Conservative estimates suggest that the total organic matter contained within the Milky Way would be insufficient to satisfy the appetites of all the approaching hive fleets combined. The mathematical models indicate that even complete Imperial victory in the current conflicts would only delay the inevitable consumption of all life in the galaxy. These calculations have led to the development of desperate contingency plans that include the possibility of evacuating human populations to other galaxies, though the technological challenges of such an undertaking remain insurmountable. The extinction scenarios developed by Imperial strategists encompass multiple pathways through which Tyranid activity could lead to the complete collapse of galactic civilization. The most optimistic projections suggest that continued resistance could extend human survival for several millennia, while pessimistic assessments indicate that total ecological collapse could occur within centuries. The psychological impact of these predictions on Imperial leadership has been carefully managed to prevent despair from undermining defensive efforts, but the knowledge that victory may be impossible has fundamentally altered strategic planning. The theological implications of the Tyranid threat have created new schisms within the Imperial ecclesiarchy regarding the nature of the Emperor's protection and humanity's ultimate destiny. Some factions argue that the Tyranid invasion represents the ultimate test of human faith, and that spiritual purity will provide protection against biological corruption. Others contend that the threat is so absolute that traditional religious responses are inadequate, leading to calls for new forms of worship that emphasize genetic sanctity and biological warfare. These theological debates have practical implications for Imperial society, affecting everything from marriage laws to medical practices. The hope that exists within Imperial resistance efforts stems not from confidence in ultimate victory, but from the recognition that each day of continued existence represents a triumph against impossible odds. The courage displayed by Imperial forces facing an enemy that threatens not just death but complete absorption into an alien consciousness has become a source of inspiration that transcends traditional military valor. Stories of soldiers choosing destruction over assimilation have created new forms of heroic narrative that emphasize the preservation of individual identity as the highest form of service to the Emperor. The despair that shadows Imperial civilization in the face of the Tyranid threat is equally profound, stemming from the recognition that conventional concepts of victory and defeat may be meaningless against an enemy that can learn from every encounter and adapt to any countermeasure. The knowledge that future generations will inherit an increasingly desperate struggle for survival has created new forms of fatalism, an existential questioning that challenge traditional Imperial optimism about humanity's destiny among the stars. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Tyrannic Wars represent more than military conflicts. They embody the ultimate test of what it means to be human in a universe where consciousness itself has become a battlefield. The shadow that falls across the galaxy carries with it the promise that somewhere in the intergalactic void, ancient hungers stir with patient malevolence, and the Great Devourer continues its inexorable advance toward the consumption of all things. Yet in that darkness, the defenders of humanity continue their vigil, knowing that their resistance may be futile but understanding that the preservation of hope itself has become the most essential victory of all. The Tyrannic Wars thus stand as testament to both the nobility and tragedy of human existence in the 41st millennium, a reminder that even in the face of cosmic horror beyond comprehension, the flame of human courage burns bright enough to illuminate the darkness, if only for a moment before the shadow falls forever across the stars.